So in this video, I'm going to be talking about how you can borrow your way out of debt. Hey, what's up guys? Dan Trevidi here. I hope you're all well. As ever, before we get started, if you could do me a huge favor and smash the like button, and don't forget to hit subscribe and the little bell icon next to it. That is quite a bold statement. How can you literally borrow more money to get yourself out of debt? And it might sound very strange, but I'm really talking to the people who are in debt and don't have rich families or lots of assets to sell to pay off that debt, and they don't really know how to get out of debt, let alone to get into a position where they could potentially start investing in something like property. And the reason why I'm doing this video is because I was in that situation years ago, and I was able to get myself out of that situation. And at the time, I didn't really know what I was doing was actually borrowing my way out of it. But when I look back on it, that is exactly what I had to do to get out of that situation. And it was all about switching my current debt from bad debt to what we call good debt. And what I mean by that is when you borrow money to buy something which is a cost, a liability, and that can be anything from buying clothes on a credit card and not paying the balance off, right through to borrowing money to buy a watch or a TV set, all of those sorts of things, right through to what we call good debt, which is borrowing money to buy something like an asset which pays you back over time and can either pay the debt down, cover the interest costs, or both, and even maybe make you some profit. And property is a really good example of it in its simplest form. Don't get me wrong, you do have other aspects to consider when buying properties, which can turn an asset into a liability if you don't get it right. But let's backtrack. So if I go back maybe 15, 16 years ago, and I had a car on finance, I had a couple of properties, all massively over leveraged, massive interest rates, but it didn't matter. Money was easy to borrow. I had a pretty good job, so it didn't really matter what was going out because I always had something coming in. And when you're in the sort of height of any market or things are going really good, you need to prepare and plan for the worst case scenario, and you need to build yourself basically a wall, a shield of what I call good assets, good debt, so you could ride the wave of any shift and change. And having lots of bad debt doesn't do that. It actually makes you very, very vulnerable when interest rates rise or liabilities plummet in value, or the income that you're reliant on, maybe your sole income, reduces or even dries up completely. And when you're in that situation, it's really hard to know how to get out of it. So if I backtrack, when I was in sort of the height of my low, if you put it that way, I was like 40 grand in debt. I had a couple of properties that were all in negative equity. The rent wasn't covering the mortgage, so every month I had a negative balance, and I was living in my parents' spare bedroom, no job, no source of income, loads of debt, and really nowhere to go. And what I realized is there was a fork where I maybe made the wrong decision. And that was moving away from property and going into retail. And had I have carried on in property, I may have been more successful earlier. I may have lost everything. Who knows? We will never know. But that shift, when I backtracked, that shift from property to another business was where I went wrong. And I knew that had I have carried on in the property direction, but become a little bit more savvy with how I invested funds, how I spent them, and the market that I focused on, I may have not only been able to ride the wave of that recession, but I may have had cash to pick up some of the great deals that I obviously missed out on at that time. So in that position, no job, loads of debt, really no asset value because it was all in negative equity, and every month a massive shortfall in terms of income versus expenditure. So what I decided to do right then, I was like 22, 23, and I decided that I needed to get back into property and I needed to do it. And the way I only had to do it was to get a mortgage. I had no money, I had no rich family members that I could call upon, and no other really direction. And at the time, I didn't know anything about joint ventures and all these various different ways of doing it, property sourcing, rent to rent. I didn't know anything about it. I just knew that property, it didn't matter how much money I had to borrow, if I could buy a property and increase the value would increase on the purchase price, not the amount of money that I had effectively borrowed or put in as a deposit. And that really resonated with me, because I thought to myself, if I've got 100 quid in the bank and I was really lucky to get a 10% interest rate, I would only earn 10 quid on that 100 quid. But if I was able to borrow like 100% of £100,000 property, and I could increase that value by the same 10%, I would make £10,000. And the £10,000 would all be mine. It would be all my profit. And it doesn't matter how much I had to borrow to buy that property, I could pay that back once I'd sold the asset or refinanced it. And that was kind of my first sort of step 101 into the new direction of what I would call my property journey. And that resonated with me so much that I knew that I needed to take my current situation and trade it out into a position where I was mortgageable, because there was no way I was getting a mortgage. We were deep in a recession, lenders were going bankrupt everywhere. I had like 40 grand's worth of debt, and my assets or my property were in negative equity. So I started doing the most boring thing you could probably think of as a 22-year-old. I was still going out and, you know, all those things that you would do as a 23-year-old on a very, very limited budget. My only source of income at the time was actually doing a car boot sale on a Sunday, selling stock that I had left over from this like closed business. And that income would sort of fund my very, very basic lifestyle, which was going to the gym, maybe a Pizza Hut, and going out like once or twice a month. So reverse engineering it, I knew I needed to make myself mortgageable. So I started reading mortgage companies that were still really secure in the market, and what their criterias were in the new sort of world of property purchasing. And straight away, I knew that buy to let was just too much of a reach to me, because I didn't have the funds to put in like a 25% deposit. I knew that I needed to buy somewhere for myself to live in, and that enabled me to get like a 95% mortgage or even 100% mortgage. And those criterias for those lenders and those types of products were a lot stricter. The income was higher, the borrowing debt levels needed to be lower. Some people looked at your current properties that you owned and yet you rented out, and if they were in negative equity or negative cash flow, they wouldn't lend. And that was the situation I had. So I had one of my biggest debts was a finance that I took out, personal loan, to buy a car, and I'd sold the car because I couldn't afford to run it, but I didn't pay the loan off. So the loan was still ticking there, and it was probably the biggest single debt that I had. And I knew that I needed to try and pay this loan off. And alongside that was some credit cards, which were not 0%. Literally, I'd put some purchases on the credit cards, and then I was paying literally the minimum payment every month, which the interest rates would be ridiculously high. So I knew those credit cards and this debt was the thing I needed to pay off. And then I knew that one of my bad performing properties needed to be sold. It was that bad that it was going to put one of the lenders that I wanted to work with off. So I decided to start to engage with local agents in the market. It was a completely different area. It was like 100 miles away from where I live. One of the reasons why I now only invest in my local market. And in the end, I decided to put it to auction, and I set the reserve literally at the mortgage balance plus the auctioneer fee. So I was getting none of my money that I'd put in back. I just needed to get rid of this dead asset, this bad property. And the other thing is I needed to get a job. I needed an income to, one, pay my debts, and two, make myself mortgageable. And this is where I then jumped into a job which I didn't really like. I didn't really agree with what the company did, but I needed a job and I needed an income. And I did sort of throw myself straight into that. And it had things that benefited me, like a company car, which means I didn't need to fork out more money to buy a car, because every spare bit of money that I had was gonna go to buy the next property. So fast forward, I was able to come to agreements with some credit card companies to pay chunks off every month to fall inside with when I had wages coming in. My parents were happy for me to stay there a little bit longer. And I started paying off chunks of loans and various bits and pieces. And I was able to sell that property, that really bad property, out of auction, but under auction conditions, because someone had seen it, that it was going to auction. And I actually sold it for a little bit more than the reserve. So I made a little bit of money, and that cash that I got in paid off a credit card. So all of a sudden, if we fast forward maybe a year, 18 months, I was in a far stronger position. But by this point, 100% mortgages had completely gone, and I was still in quite a bit of debt, and I needed to make some money. And the income from the job was kind of getting rid of my debt, albeit very slowly, and it was making me more mortgageable, but it wasn't really enabling me to save a deposit. And it was only like a 5% deposit that I was looking for. So I knew that I needed to make some more money. So this is where I started to side hustle. So I started buying containers of damaged stock from Argos and Homebase. And then I would spend my weekends and evenings building that stock up and then selling it on eBay or Gumtree. And then that moved to more of a business where I was buying second stock. So it's all brand new, it wasn't damaged. And I was selling that using a courier company to deliver it. So I kind of had a nice little business that was making me money that I could do weekends and evenings. And then that developed into sourcing some of the key items that I thought were selling really well from China and then selling them over at eBay. And this was back in 2010, 2011. So we're talking about similar to this fulfillment by Amazon that people now do as a full-time business. And I was kind of doing that, but I was doing it literally as a means to an end so I could get enough money to clump together to buy a property. And it wasn't long before I found a property, 100K, I needed 5K to buy it with some fees, and then I was able to do it. And then I moved into that property, did some work on it and added value, and then eventually refinanced it onto a buy to let, moved into another property, got some money out, and then I was able to start taking myself away from a bad debt position. And I was accruing far more debt. The value of my debt was increasing hugely, but it was all really good debt because it was secured against properties that were assets that were not only growing in equity, but they were providing me an income after I paid off the costs, like the mortgage. So I was adding to my income, and the compound effect was meant that I was able to pay down my debt quicker, save more money, and keep going again. And that was how I did it. That was how I borrowed myself out of a very negative debt position. And fast forward on, that philosophy that I took to borrowing money has resonated to deals that I still do today. And if you take the barn conversion that I live in, which was a 7-figure conversion, and we did it without any lender involved, but even though we had cash in the bank, towards the end, I started buying big purchases on 0% credit cards, because I knew if anything went really wrong with this project or another project and cash needed to go out really quickly, then I had the cash to enable me to do that. And as long as the 0% period was long enough for me to get back in and pay that down, then it was something that I considered. And I think in the end I put 50 grand's worth of purchases towards the end of this project on 0% credit cards. And we then went into a pandemic. No one really knew what the market was going to do. I had some cash. I was able to pick up some great deals. And then those deals have now completed, and some of them have been refinanced. And then those credit cards started to come to an end, and I had the cash, so I just paid them off. And I put myself into a position of strength because I knew how to use lenders and the power of borrowing to my own advantage. And I did it not when I needed to, I did it when I was in a position of strength, because a lender is more likely to lend to you when you are in a strong position than you are if you desperately need the funds. So that's something you're planning that you must always consider. And that is another great form of debt, because I borrowed short term for 0%, which enabled me to use my cash to go and buy properties that I've made literally tens of thousands of pounds on. So the ability to borrow cheap or zero cost enable me to make more money in a shift in the market, which is what this is all about, preparing for shifts and opportunities in the market. And once you understand the ability and the idea and the power of borrowing funds for good debt, you will very quickly shift from being someone in a position of negative debt or bad debt to lots of good debt, which makes you more money and either financially free, a millionaire, whatever your goal is, whatever you want to do. But that's really it from me. Just to finish on, don't ever borrow money. Don't ever put anything on a credit card like a training course or a mentorship. That is the worst thing you can do. There is enough information out there in books, on YouTube videos, which are completely free. All we want you to do is to smash the like button and hit subscribe. But that's it from me. Hope you found the content rich. I'll catch you all on the next video.